The story of Germany's Sixth Army at Stalingrad does not end with surrender in February 1943. It ends years later in prison camps, hospital barracks, and silent train stations, because out of more than 90,000 men who marched into Soviet captivity, only about 5,000 ever saw home again. Why does an entire army simply vanish from history like that? And what really happens to them after the guns fall silent? Stay with me until the end of this video, because the last phase of this story, what happens after the surrender, is darker, more complicated, and more revealing than anything that happens in the ruins of Stalingrad itself. Set up a victory that turns into a trap. The hell? You are a German soldier of the Sixth Army marching east across the dusty plains toward a name you've heard again and again in speeches and radio broadcasts: Stalingrad. The plan sounds simple. Take the city on the Volga, cut Soviet supply lines, open the way to the Caucasus oil fields. Hitler calls it decisive. Commanders repeat the same phrase: one last push. By September, the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus fights its way into Stalingrad itself. Street by street, building by building, you advance. Soviet civilians have dug trenches and fortifications. Families still hide in cellars beneath burning houses. German reports talk about ferocious fighting, some of the most concentrated of the entire war. But nobody tells you what you're walking into. From August to November 1942, the Sixth Army loses over 60,000 men just fighting its way to the Volga, killed, wounded, missing. And yet, by November, German troops control most of the city. To you, it looks like victory. To Soviet commanders outside the city, it looks like an opportunity. How can an army that holds 90% of its objectives still end up destroyed? Beat 1, Operation Uranus. The door slams shut. The real answer begins far from the ruined streets, out on the frozen steppe north and south of Stalingrad. Hitler has pushed his best formations into the city itself. The flanks, those long, exposed lines on either side of the Sixth Army, are held mainly by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian troops, under-equipped and stretched thin over huge distances. They're supposed to hold back the Red Army while the Germans finish off the city. Instead, they become the weakest link. Soviet planners see it. They know they can't keep grinding frontal assaults in the city forever. So they prepare something different: Operation Uranus. They quietly mass over 1 million men, thousands of tanks and guns, not in front of Stalingrad but around it. On 19th November 1942, the steppe erupts. Over 3,500 Soviet guns fire a massive barrage against Romanian positions north of the city. Communication lines collapse, defensive positions shatter, and entire units begin to disintegrate within hours. Imagine being inside Stalingrad at this moment. You hear rumbling in the distance. You see smoke on the horizon, but your officers still assure you the situation is under control. Is it? Within days, Soviet forces punch through the Romanian lines on both flanks and begin to swing inward, like a giant metal gate closing. On 23rd November, north of the city, Soviet spearheads meet near the town of Kalich, locking the Sixth Army and other Axis units inside a tightening ring. Between 250,000 and 300,000 Axis soldiers are now trapped in an area roughly 50 kilometers wide. Infantry, tank crews, support staff, medical personnel, Luftwaffe ground crews. An entire community of soldiers suddenly cut off from the world. At first, many inside the pocket still believe this is temporary. The Wehrmacht has broken out of encirclements before. Relief will come. Supplies will come. But the harsh winter of the Volga is about to answer that belief. Beat. The frozen pocket. Hunger. Orders and denial. When Hitler hears the Sixth Army is surrounded, he makes a decision that will decide the fate of every man inside that pocket. He refuses to let Paulus break out. Instead, he declares Stalingrad a fortress to be held at all costs and promises the Luftwaffe will supply the encircled army by air. On paper, the daily requirement is hundreds of tons of food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. In reality, aircraft can rarely deliver even a fraction of that. The weather worsens. Airfields freeze. Aircraft are shot down. At times, deliveries fall below 100 tons a day nowhere, near enough to sustain 250,000 men. Inside the pocket, rations shrink. Horses are slaughtered for food. Units strip buildings for firewood. Medical supplies run out. Frostbite, dysentery, and exhaustion become as deadly as bullets. At the top, the situation twists into something almost surreal. On 7 January 1943, Soviet General Konstantin Rokossovsky sends Paulus an offer: surrender, and your men will receive food, medical treatment, and be allowed to keep their personal effects. Paulus asks Hitler for permission to accept. The answer is simple: no surrender. Weeks later, Hitler promotes Paulus to field marshal, clearly expecting him to commit suicide rather than be captured. Because no German field marshal has ever fallen into enemy hands. But Paulus refuses to die for Hitler's symbolism. He chooses to live. And that single decision seals the fate of tens of thousands of men who will now share his captivity. What would you do in that underground HQ in a ruined city with your army collapsing around you and an order from a distant leader to stand fast? Would you obey? Break out? Surrender? Hold that thought, because the moral weight of that question doesn't end on 2 February 1943. It follows the survivors for the rest of their lives. If you're still with me now, pause for a second and think about that dilemma: obedience, responsibility, survival. Then keep watching, because what happens next to these soldiers after they lay down their weapons is rarely shown in war movies, but is where the real human cost begins. Beat 3, surrender. 91,000 men vanish. By late January 1943, the Sixth Army is effectively divided and collapsing. The northern pocket falls first. On 31 January, Soviet troops reach Paulus's command post in the cellar of a department store. He is captured sick, exhausted, and very much alive. On 2 February 1943, the last organized resistance in Stalingrad stops. What remains of the Sixth Army and its attached units, about 91,000 men, lay down their arms and surrender. Among them are 24 generals and around 2,500 officers. To the German public, Stalingrad is a shock. A whole field army has been annihilated or captured, over 147,000 killed or wounded in the battle. With the survivors now in enemy hands, to the Soviet Union, it's a turning point. Stalingrad becomes a symbol that the tide of war can be turned. But for the 91,000 prisoners now trudging eastward, the battle has simply changed shape. Many are already on the brink of collapse. They are starving, frostbitten, suffering from untreated wounds and disease. They expect a POW camp, something like what they've seen in German hands. Harsh, but structured, with some hope of survival. Instead, they walk sometimes for days in freezing temperatures with minimal food or shelter. Thousands die on the march alone, collapsing on the snow-covered roads. Their comrades keep walking. There is no way to stop, no way to bury them properly. You might think the story ends here, with prisoners behind barbed wire. It doesn't. For most of these men, this is only the beginning of a second, drawn-out war against cold, malnutrition, and time. Beat 4. In captivity, camp life, and slow death. Once the surviving German and Axis prisoners reach Soviet camps, They join a system already overwhelmed by war. The conditions vary from makeshift barracks near the front to more permanent labor camps deeper inside the Soviet Union. But the common themes are familiar: overcrowding, lack of adequate heating, limited food, and hard physical labor. Diseases like typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread rapidly. Many prisoners arrive with almost no body fat, weakened by months of siege. Their immune systems simply cannot cope. Soviet authorities now face a grim reality. They have tens of thousands of enemy soldiers to feed at a moment when their own civilians are suffering. Their own soldiers are exhausted, and their infrastructure is shattered. In that environment, German POWs often sit at the bottom of the priority list. The numbers speak for themselves. Out of the 91,000 who surrender at Stalingrad, only around 5,000 to 6,000 eventually return home a decade later. The rest die in captivity of illness, malnutrition, exposure, or complications that build up over years of forced labor. Think about that. A soldier survives the advance into Russia, the brutal street fighting, the encirclement, the starvation winter, and the final collapse only to die in a camp, far from home, nameless, long after the battle is over. Some officers, including Paulus, eventually cooperate with Soviet authorities, joining anti-Nazi propaganda efforts, and later testifying at trials. Their choices remain controversial. Were they opportunists trying to survive, or men who genuinely broke with the regime that sent them into Stalingrad? Meanwhile, back in Germany, families receive sparse, euphemistic notices. Missing in action at Stalingrad. Some wait years before they accept that missing really means never coming home. Here's the quiet irony. While Hitler rages about a field marshal who refused to kill himself rather than be captured, tens of thousands of ordinary soldiers die slow, unheroic deaths that never make propaganda posters or speeches. Is that what honor in war really looks like? Beat 5. What Stalingrad did to Germany and the world. Stalingrad is more than a single battle. It's a fracture line in the Second World War. Before Stalingrad, German forces still advance, still talk about victory, still project an aura of invincibility. After Stalingrad, that myth shatters. The defeat forces Germany onto the defensive on the Eastern Front. From then on, the Wehrmacht retreats step by step, city by city, until it reaches Berlin. On a human level, the destruction of the Sixth Army and the disappearance of most of its survivors into Soviet camps burn a scar into German society. One army, effectively wiped from the map, about 275,000 men lost in and around Stalingrad, including 150,000 killed and 91,000 taken prisoner. And from those 91,000, only a tiny fraction ever returned to tell the story. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad becomes a symbol of endurance and sacrifice, but also a reminder of the immense cost, around 1 million casualties on their side, and tens of thousands of civilians killed in the city. It is remembered as a triumph, but a triumph built on the bodies of soldiers and civilians from many nations. This is where the moral dilemma from earlier comes back. If you are a commander like Paulus, facing impossible orders from above and a collapsing reality on the ground, what do you owe your men? If you're a soldier, do you fight on for abstract ideas, honor, duty, ideology, or for the comrades next to you trying to stay alive one more day? And if you're watching this now, in a world still scarred by war, what does victory look like? When you know that even survivors can disappear into silence for years after the shooting stops. Closing reflection and CTA. The fate of Germany's Sixth Army at Stalingrad is not just that it was defeated, it is that it was consumed first by strategic overreach and fanatic orders, then by encirclement and starvation, and finally by the slow machinery of captivity. An entire army marches into the east, only a handful of men ride trains back west. Years later, carrying stories that many people do not want to hear. Their experience forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that blind obedience can destroy more than disobedience, that propaganda hides the real cost of war, and that the line between victor and victim is often thinner than we think. If this story made you see Stalingrad differently, not just as a famous battle, but as a human disaster that wiped out an army long after the shooting stopped, then don't let it end here. For a deeper look into how the trap at Stalingrad was set in the first place, watch the video I've linked on the screen now about Operation Uranus and the intelligence failures that allowed over 250,000 men to be encircled in just a few days. If you want more human-centered war histories told with this level of detail and honesty, tap like, subscribe, and stay with this channel. Because behind every name in a history book, there's a story like this one soldier, one decision, one moment where everything changes. And we're just getting started.